Last night, the president used a prime-time address to the nation to insult a lot of Americans. Specifically, Americans who believe in biblical marriage and those who believe there is a better way than abortion. Now, the president implied that those who disagree with him don't just have a difference of opinion, but they're trying to take the nation backwards. They're angry. They are a threat to democracy, a threat to the rule of law, even a threat to the very soul of this country. Well, what should you do in response? Should you get angry? Joining me now for our weekly Worldview segment here in studio is David Closson. He's our director of the Center for Biblical Worldview. David, good to see you.
Hey, great to be with you, Joseph.
Now, first, are you surprised by the accusations, if that's the right word, that the president made against what really represents about half the country?
I'm not, and I'm not surprised, Joseph, because I've been paying attention to the Biden presidency. Since his inauguration day last year, he promised a lot of unity and bringing the country together, this battle for the soul of America. But over the last year and a half or so that Joe Biden's been president, the policies that this administration has pursued has been steamrolling whenever they can people of faith, kind of marginalizing anyone who disagrees with them on really significant issues. So last night's speech, although it was, and I know we've been talking about it all day, it was an interesting speech. It was a very political speech, but I was not at all surprised by the tone and tenor of the speech at all, just because this has been characteristic of Joe Biden and those that work in his administration since day one, really.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the people who watch that speech and a lot of people who are listening to us and watching us today, these are Christians who care about public policy. And of course, politics is an emotional game, right? People get emotionally invested in the issues and sometimes in the people and the parties and all those things. So when you see something like that come from your president, there's a lot of people who will feel insulted. Like, my feelings are hurt, maybe seriously, maybe just politically. I'm just kind of angry because you've misrepresented me, you've mischaracterized me. I don't think that way at all. Yes, I'm pro-life, but I'm not trying to destroy the country, whatever that emotion is. How should Christians respond to moments when we feel insulted?
Yeah, such a good question. And I think it's important just to realize, elections have consequences. And the fact that Joe Biden won an election, he's president, and this is what we deal with. Now, it is true, watching that speech last night, myself included, I think there's millions of social conservative, faithful Christians who, listened to the speech and thought, he's talking about me when he's talking about people who are pro-life and pro-marriage. He didn't use those terms, but that's who he was clearly referring to. And probably thought, I'm not a threat to democracy. I'm not this vicious, mean, subversive person. And I think there is kind of your first impulse is to get defensive and to kind of want to, lash out in some way. But actually, I think that's where, as Christians, we need to go back to our Bibles. Right. This is our Worldview segment where we like to go to Scripture. And actually, Jesus talked about this a lot. When I was thinking about this question, Joseph, I went to the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus said in Matthew 5, he said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And he actually looked at the crowd and said, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of things against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Yeah. And there are other scriptures where Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. 1 Peter, he said, don't be surprised when the fiery trial comes upon you, as if you weren't expecting this. Yeah. So throughout the New Testament, Joseph, we see the Lord graciously preparing his people to encounter difficulties. And for 2,000 years, Christians have encountered difficulty. Yeah. So we shouldn't be surprised. We're in a long line of people who have been marginalized.
Yeah, and it's an important point there. Blessed are you when they falsely accuse you. And there is something that needs to happen, right? When somebody criticizes you, the accusation better be false. Because the reality is, right, in American politics, sometimes we do misbehave. And we saw what happened on January 6th. Misbehaved, right? Lots of people did. Shouldn't have happened. There are temptations to be angry and lash out, and we see incidences, flare up. They seem to be with more frequency, and as we've discussed today, that's a bipartisan problem. Sin is not a right-wing or a left-wing thing. When people's hearts get invested in the wrong things and they get angry and a goal gets blocked, they can be tempted to do things that are sinful, right? So if we are being accused of things and insulted because of actual sinful behavior we've engaged in, we need to correct that. But sometimes it's just by association. And in that case, we can, carry on.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, again, we shouldn't be surprised that this is happening in 2022. Our colleague George Barna has been doing worldview surveys, for years. And the survey he did for us here at the Center for Biblical Worldview at FRC showed that only 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview, that they look out at the world, and they look at these policy questions, and only 6% of our friends and neighbors would have this worldview that social conservatives have. Yeah. And so increasingly, the views and beliefs we have are going to not just be seen as outdated or just old-fashioned. They're going to be seen as bigoted and subversive. And I think we need to be prepared for that, and we need to prepare our hearts for that, and to respond graciously, to respond convictionally, but to realize that's going to come to us.
Yeah, and we've talked on the show this week because this is the 1 year anniversary of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? And we've talked to people from Voice of the Martyrs who have told the stories of what life is like for our brothers and sisters in Afghanistan right now, right? We might be frustrated with Joe Biden, but Joe Biden is no Taliban, right? And we're thankful for that. We're thankful that the way Joe Biden speaks seems outrageous to us because it's not normal. When those who are living under the Taliban, right, they would give anything to just deal with the problems that Joe Biden gives them. Now, that's not a reason to be indifferent, but it's helpful perspective for us as Christians to understand that facing, opposition from our political leaders isn't really a new problem for Christians, is it?
No, it's not. And I think, the context that Christianity was born in the ancient Roman Empire, some of the first generations of Christians were blamed. I think of Nero, who probably was the one that set a fire there in Rome and blamed the Christians. Generation later, Diocletian blamed the Christian and goes after them. And so I think you're right. We, as Christians in the 21st century here in America, we've in some sense become accustomed to a comfortable lifestyle. But our forebears in the faith, and again, that's why I think everyone should study church history, because we're not the first to wrestle with these issues or to have to think biblically about the situations we find ourselves in. We stand on the shoulders of 2,000 years of faithful Christians who have sought to be faithful to the Lord. And I think that's what we need to try to do the best we can. So when you hear Joe Biden say those things, well, what does 1 Timothy 2 say? It says we should pray for those that we might lead a peaceable and quiet life. We still engage, and we engage robustly. But, one of the things I think every Christian should do that saw that speech, pray for Joe Biden. Pray that he has wisdom and discernment to make right choices.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we are instructed to pray for those who spitefully use us, to love our enemies and pray for them specifically, is because it's really hard to harbor bitterness and resentment against somebody that you've prayed for, that you recognize. And this is the discipline, I think, is realizing that though Joe Biden has offended me, though somebody has offended me, they still bear the image of God. Jesus still died for them just like he did for me. They are still work in progress, just like I am. And when I pray for them in a way that sincerely is seeking God's best for their life, that makes it harder for me to be bitter, to harbor unforgiveness. And if I'm not bitter and I'm not harboring unforgiveness, that makes my life better, doesn't it?
No, I agree with you, Joseph, and that's why I think, as I've adopted a practice in my own life, to try to pray every night for the President of the United States. Prayed for Barack Obama during his presidency, the 4 years of the Trump industry. I try to do that now for President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, even though I fiercely disagree with many of their policy situations. But that's, again, where a biblical worldview gives us a different sort of engagement. You just mentioned it. We as Christians realize that every single person is made in the image of God, which means they have inherent value and dignity. It's interesting. I think Joe Biden actually in his speech last night used that phrase, image of God. And on that point, he's right, that we are all made in God's image and have value. Right. And I think that's where a Christian who engages in politics, we're going to fight for the bills we care about, we're going to fight for the candidates we care about, but our engagement should look different than the world's.
Yeah. There is still so much irony in saying, we are all made in the image of God, therefore all those pro-life people are a threat to the country. But we're not dwelling on that right now. James chapter 1. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, knowing that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Should the things that the president says about us change what we do in about 30 seconds?
No, it doesn't. I think as Christians, we need to continue to seek to live lives full of courage, conviction, character, and realize God's called us to be faithful. And so the president can say whatever he wants about those of us who he disagrees with on these issues. We should pray for him. Maybe this redoubles our efforts to pray for him. But let's be faithful to what God has called us to do in our homes, in our workplace. Nothing that any elected leader says will change that.
Yeah. David Closson, thanks so much.
Thanks, Joseph.